Hello everybody and welcome to the third installment of Tutorial Tuesdays. So I recently created this image as fan art for a new game that I've been playing called Nuclear Throne by Vlambeer, and I wanted to do a tutorial today on procedural texturing. So we're going to be covering how to texture the cow skull. I'll let you follow along with whatever model you want because it's procedural. It does not require UVs for the most part. So let's go ahead and get started. The final result will look something like this, where we have a nice procedural sort of bone material, which it doesn't look super photorealistic or anything, but there are some interesting techniques and hopefully you'll get some nice tips out of this. The bone material is completely procedural. The horns required UV unwrapping, and I'll explain why in just a little bit. But let's get started, and to do that we're going to delete these materials so we just have a straight up white cow skull. I'm going to leave this rendering. Hopefully it will not affect the recording too much. Okay, so first step first, we're going to do most of our work in the node editor today, so we don't even need these sidebars. We can just get rid of them. You can also hit N and T to turn them off and on. So let's go ahead and get started. Step one is to get the color right. So I'm actually going to undo deleting these materials that I did just to save time, because this is a sculpture. It has very high vertex count, which it was actually much higher, but then I used the decimate modifier to sort of make it a lot lower poly. It's still messy as all hell, but using procedural texturing techniques, you don't really need to UV unwrap it, except for the horns, which again I'll explain later. So, what I'm going to do is just delete these materials. That way the assignments stay to each part. What I did is per face assignments because I was getting this project done fast. Normally you would, in other 3D software it's generally frowned upon to do per face assignments, but Blender is really set up to use per face assignments like crazy. So we're going to go ahead and create the bone material. I will leave this guy rendering right here. So, step one is to get the color correct. So to do that, we can use the color picker and pick it from the image. Oh wow, it already looks like bone. No, it does not, but let's keep going. By the way, for the background, for reflections and stuff, I'm using a sky from cgskies.com, which has a fantastic resource. I'm also using a sun lamp to light this while I'm testing my textures. So the next step will be to start adding in some detail. So, looking at the material, we have diffuse, and the first thing first is mix two shaders, and you probably guessed it, we're going to throw in a glossy here just to give them some specular highlights. Then we can up the roughness of this to make it a fairly wide specular highlight, and then we can also lower the mixture quite a bit. We just want some sort of reflection, just a little bit, because everything in the world has a specular highlight. Whether you believe me or not, everything is reflective to some extent. So the next step will be to add some cuts in it, or cracks. I was looking for the word cracks. So how we do that is we use a noise texture. So texture, noise, we can input the factor to displacement, which we're not seeing any cracks yet. That's because we haven't mapped it or anything. So for the texture coordinate, we're going to use object, which uses the 3D object as the coordinates for the object. We're going to up the detail to 12 because we don't want a low resolution texture. And then, oh, this is starting to slow down. Okay, I'm going to use the border here just so we're only rendering a small portion, and my thing will go a lot faster because it's slowing down severely since my computer's outdated. I'm rendering and I have a recording going. So the next step to doing cracks is to use a color ramp like so, and then black is down, white is up. So you'll see that right now we have white, but what we want is two whites and a black. So what this is doing is mapping it from black to white on here. So everything on this spectrum we're now mapping to be white. This one tiny slice of color mapping to be black, and then everything over here we're mapping to be white in the noise, which noise by default again would look like this. So the color ramp is just taking it and remapping the blacks and whites. So if we have just one slice of black in the middle, we're getting these neat cracks. But that is way, way too intense, first of all. So what we can do here is take the black. Since it's going all the way from white to black, that's a pretty intense bump map. So to lower that, we can take our little black slider and we can up the brightness, and it will slowly make the bump get less intense. Something like that should be pretty good. Now we also have a ton of these cracks, and we don't necessarily want that. They're really small, and you can see that they're in patches. So to do that, to make them bigger, we're just going to scale down the texture. The lower the number, the bigger the texture, because the scale actually represents repetitions. Alright, so we've got some interesting looking cracks. Still quite a few cracks, so we can also play around with where we want this to be positioned on here and get completely different results. We'll just leave it there for now. That's looking pretty neat. I'm actually going to scale this down to 1. So we get even fewer cracks, and then we can also tighten this up just a bit. We really want bigger circles though, so you can't see that it's a circle. So what I'm going to do is move the slider around until I am satisfied. I think that positioning looks pretty cool. So then what we can do to actually break the cracks up a little bit is, since the white is the regular level of the bone on the texture, we can input another texture, so texture, noise texture, object mapping, and then we can add another color ramp, and we can just crush the whites to all hell, and the blacks as well, and set the detail to 12, scale maybe down to 2. And then we can take these two textures and mix them. Texturing, when you're doing black and white mixtures like this, is all about math. So what we're going to do is add and clamp, which right now it's looking like we have way too much white breaking up the cracks. So what this is doing, I'll show you here just a second, is it's taking this texture and it's adding the whites of this to this guy, which white is the upper level of the bone cracks. So any of the white on this that goes over the cracks when we add it will essentially remove the cracks in that area, which helps break up the perfect rings we get from the clouds texture. So let me plug this back in, and you can see that we're now getting less cracks, but I kind of want to break it up just a little. I'll let you play with it yourself to get however you want on your procedural bone texture, but I think this is looking pretty cool. I'm actually going to also, no I'm not. I was going to say I'm going to take the bone texture and darken it, but we're going to do something there next. Also, what we're going to do here is make the add factor 1, just so it's adding by factor of 1 and there won't be subtle cracks where we want it broken up. And then we can take it and color mix, color or texture noise. I use the noise quite a bit because you can do a lot with it, and that also gets the object coordinate, and we're going to mix this in, except rather than using mix, we're going to use overlay, because that will keep the original bones, should have kept the original bones intact and added this to it, but it doesn't look like it's doing that fantastic of a job. Let's do it by factor of 1. Okay, we're not seeing anything. Let's just multiply over the cracks. Set the detail up to 12, and we'll set the factor down to like 0.2, 0.3. So we just want some extra detail on the bones. So now we're getting some of this noise, which looks pretty cool. Now it's actually starting to look like bone. This is actually going to be a short tutorial because there are just a few things left to do. I just wanted to give you sort of a quick introduction to my methods for procedural texturing stuff very quickly in Blender. So another thing you can do is use vertex paint. So let me show you that. If we go to the vertex paint mode, you'll see that I have this sort of occlusion looking pass on it, and let me show you how you can make that very easy. So I can go to Paint, set vertex colors to white, and this only works on high poly meshes, by the way, because it uses the vertex to color them. So we can go to Paint and Dirty Vertex Colors, and it will automatically generate this sort of dirt map for you, which is really, it's a really nice feature. So what we can do with that dirt map is take it into the Cycles texture editor. So if we go back to rendered, you'll notice that we just have one color, and that's kind of ugly. And a lot of times people will texture in occlusion maps just to sort of add a bit of dirt, as you can see down here. So how you do that in Cycles is we're going to do a color mix RGB, copy this color, paste it, mix, and then we're going to, in the 0, okay, so when you're mapping 0, 1, or black, white when you have a factor image, so the first slot is black, the second slot is white. So in the blacks, which are the dark areas on the dirt map, we want this to be darker, like he's a little bit dirty. And then how you actually access the dirt map is through input attribute. And this attribute is under the vertex colors, and it is cull. You can name it whatever you want right here, but I usually just go with the defaults because I go fast. So then we can plug this in, and now you can see that the dirt map is actually taking effect. But the beautiful thing about this is it treats it just like an image. So you can even use the color ramp here to sort of crush this and get more contrast in your dirt map, like so. So now we're actually getting something that looks pretty cool. And if you really wanted to, you can even add some color to this using the color ramp tool, like maybe add in a little bit of red. That's not what I wanted to do. My bad. I'm thinking about different tricks. Anyway, so if we wanted to add red, we would just add a little bit of red into this color, and that'll give us some color in the dirt. And we can probably up this just a little bit to make it a bit less intense, like so. And I think that's looking pretty cool. Now that I look at it, I think we can make the glossiness a bit less rough, so we're going to try 0.35, I guess. And that is looking pretty cool. I am actually pretty satisfied with this. You can add more passes, you can mix in more passes of noise. So for instance, if we wanted to say just add some little bumps on the bone, we can do a Shift D to copy this guy and change it to add, and then we can add a texture, noise texture, grab our object coordinate, plug the factor in here, set this to 1, and do another color ramp. You can get away doing so much with just noise textures and color ramp. It is fantastic. And then we can up this to maybe 12 to get lots of little bumps. Clamp this guy. And add by a much lower factor, just because we want these to be subtle little bumps, sort of weirdnesses on the mesh. What is the word I'm looking for? I don't know. Anyway, so we can add this by like a factor of 0.2, and we get these little bumps all over the skull just for extra added detail. It sort of helps. So that is how I procedurally textured the skull. Let's get into the horns, which does require UV unwrapping, but you can do it all within Blender, no need for Photoshop or anything for the texture painting. So I guess I'm also getting into texture painting in this tutorial. So what we're going to do is create a new material. Again, the first thing we're going to do is use the little color picker to pick the color for the horns, but that's kind of boring. So then what we can do is select everything, Smart UV Project. And this gives us absolutely atrocious UVs, especially since he's such a high poly, messy, sculpted mesh. But the beauty of this is that Blender has built-in texture painting tools that are actually pretty good. So how you access that is first we're going to create a new image. So image, new image, and we'll make it 2048 by 2048. And we'll call it horn lines. Why not? And we'll put it at exactly 50% gray. Because on a bump map, white is up, black is down, gray is middle. So I'm going to hit OK, and that gives us this image. And then in cycles to texture paint, you can hit Alt-Z to go into texture mode, but you won't see the images unless you have them over here. So we're going to save this image now as an actual file. I'll put this as hornlines.png, save image, and then we can import that image here. So texture, image texture, open, horn lines. So it's an actual file now. And we can plug the color into displacement. But now that we have an image selected, you'll see that it's actually applying to the horns when we're in texture viewport. You can also view materials mode, and that will also show your images, but texture is easier for texture painting, in my opinion. So then, T to open the tool panel. You have all of these texture painting options. I tend to like to go full screen when I'm texture painting, which is Control 1. And then you can just paint away. You generally want to lower the strength a lot when you're doing stuff like this because subtleties go a long way in bump maps. And then to get the lines, I just painted in a bunch of random lines all over him, like so. And then you can also hit F to change the brush size and sort of just paint in random lines. Because this is just going to be a bump map. Nobody's ever going to see your sort of mistakes. They're not even going to be looking that close at it. And also for texture painting, we're going to want to hide the ground plane because it's going to get in our way. So you can hit H to hide that. So going back to texture paint mode, let's continue painting. See, I tried coming up with a procedural method for... You're also going to get these weird spots because you were trying to paint where you couldn't, but I'll show you how to fix that in just a second. I tried to come up with a procedural way to do the horns, but since they're at such a weird angle, I couldn't figure out how to stretch the noise and map that properly. So if anybody knows that trick, feel free to post it in the comments. I would much appreciate that. Okay, so I mean, this is looking alright for tutorial purposes. Now to fix all of the weird areas, we can use the soften tool and just sort of soften it up a bit. That area looks like it's going to be permanently weird, which is not the worst thing in the world. This whole area isn't even going to be visible to the camera. When you're texturing and you're only doing a still image, only worry about texturing to camera because anything else is a waste of time. Right now I don't have a camera in this scene, but that is quite alright. So go back to brush, and now we're going to paint this horn. If you want to avoid these harsh lines though, just only paint on what you can see. Like if I try to paint over here, we're going to get hard lines because we couldn't see that part of the mesh. I'm not going to worry about that for the tutorial, but in my actual image I totally worried about that. And then if you want some more extreme bumps, you can also paint in some whites. And this will give you a bit more variation. Very cool. Alright, so let's go ahead and go back to object mode, hit Control 1 to return to our split screen. And this is the texture we did. However, it's not going to show up in the render, and that is because it's not saved yet. So we have to hit Save Image. So then if we render, we now have this nice horn bump map, which is not very intense. We're also getting these little cracks. That's because of the messy UVs. There are ways to fix that, I believe. I do not currently know them, and I'm not going to worry about it because for the purpose of my image, it didn't really subtract. The guy was in the background, and I mean, they're cracked horns. I'm not going to worry about extra cracks. So another thing that I did was I took this texture and I color mix RGB, Control C, Control V, Control V, and I might have just multiplied him straight over. let's take a look at that. Yeah, so that'll give us some extra detail on the horns if we just multiply this straight over. And since it's a little bit dark, what we can do, first of all, unhide the ground plane. You guessed it, we can use a color ramp. Color ramp is probably one of the most useful nodes in Blender, and we can just sort of crush the whites a little bit and darken and lighten up the blacks, just because we want a little bit of detail. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how I procedurally textured this cow skull. Hopefully you picked up some interesting tips and tricks for quickly texturing things that you don't want to UV. And hopefully you found this video helpful and informative. Stay tuned next week. I'm not sure what the tutorial will be, but there will be a tutorial on Tuesday.